welcome back to episode 2 of 10 on enterprise work management. So when it comes to Thursday and the best in show, I'm going for the sympathy vote, okay? Apparently, there's no truth in the fact that the IBM and Pega guys were doing this at the back of the rooms. But anyway. So where were we? Org model. So org model, work model. Debatable what we should have called it. But at the end of the day, this is a model by which we aim to define a lot of the semantics about how work is distributed and accessed within the overall solution. I think it was Greg from BP3 came up to me afterwards and he said, so is that kind of like Raki for BPM? And I sort of scratched my head a bit, and yeah, actually it kind of is, right? Except it's kind of all integrated into this single solution with common concepts, etc. So if you look here, you can see an org model. To us, say an org model is an artifact that lives within the workspace. It's shared amongst projects. It's shared amongst process developers that they can reference and reuse. The org model provides an overlay over the enterprise infrastructure, such as LDAP, but also presents that sort of virtual view of the functional organizational model. If I kind of drill in, you can see here, this org model actually contains 2 organizations. An organization is kind of a little bit like an internal sandbox. If I then drill in, you can get a better view. Through the delights of having a Mac, I can zoom it in for you. Can't do that on a PC, can you? 4 core concepts. The concept of an organizational unit, which is an organizational unit which can contain positions, and an OU can contain multiple positions. And this hierarchy can continue as you see fit. As you see here, this isn't a strict organizational model. This is a functional view of the organization. There are 2 other concepts, groups and resources. So you can also define groups, which is potentially how work is normally, up until recently, been used to distribute work. And you can also define resources. So my resource seems to have disappeared, which is it. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong one, sorry. You can define groups, and you can define resources. Over here, sorry, on the side here, you can see the palette of organizational units. This is a schema that we provide by default, but the product allows you to define your own schema for what is an organizational unit, what is a position, what is a group, all the attributes and properties and naming conventions that you want to use. So this is a way in which you bring your business vocabulary to the overall model that is used to distribute work and access work. As I say, the resources, you can define resource types. Bear with me here. Resources have attributes. You define resources as having attributes. This is a way in which you can define a map. There's a way post-deployment of mapping these attributes to the LDAP directory or to data within the data model. So this, again, virtualizes your model of a resource away from the underlying directory structure and allows you then to write work distribution queries down to a very fine-grained level based upon attributes of a resource such as location. Another aspect, as you might expect to see in something like a Raki-based system, is the concept of privileges. Let me see if I can zoom in on that. A concept of privileges and the concept of capabilities. Privileges are things you inherit through the privilege being associated with an organizational unit or position or a group. And capabilities are really kind of aligned with skills. They get deployed into the runtime, and then they can be associated with resources, such as, you can see here, English speaker, etc. Privileges can have qualifiers, so you can have levels of privilege, as well. The interesting thing also, we use the privilege model to not only control the way work is distributed and accessed, but also to control the things you can do within the system. So you can see here I have a privilege can view global work list. So there's a consistent model between control to features as a control to work. Org model gets deployed to the runtime. So now I switched over to a sort of an administration view. So the org model gets deployed to the runtime, and then that structure all gets represented within the system's databases. So then we can combine that with the work list view and generate these very rapidly, with very high volume, a complete view for an individual user into the whole system based upon their memberships, their skill sets, their capabilities, their privileges, and et cetera, combined with any resource patterns that need to be applied. So if you take my little example here, now you can see this replicated within the runtime organizational model, and I can put resources into each of these positions. I can do that manually through a user interface by dragging them from the LDAP directory, or I can run an automated job to populate that based upon an LDAP binding. So basically, you've got the model, which defines the vocabulary that you're going to use for work distribution and access. You've got an image in the runtime into which you place resources. So how do I use it? So let's kind of drop out back to Studio again and have a look at a very simple model. So very simple business process, makes no sense, but it's purely there to kind of show some examples. So a very basic task here called handle claim. Sorry, I'm just gone the wrong way. A very basic task here called handle claim. That's being distributed to the home CSR participant. If you look here, the home CSR is defined by a reference to the CSR within my org model. So kind of a little bit like group or role-based distribution, except all of that is reused. It's a common vocabulary across all processes, all process developers, etc. So moving on a little bit, kind of at the other extreme, and I'm kind of gone from the simplest up to the most complex. If you look at this resource, it's called qualified reviewer. If I go and look at the definition of a qualified reviewer, it's somewhat more complex. This uses a query language for resources we call RQL. Rather like SQL, it's a set language for doing very fine-grained selection of resources. But you can see here that all the operators within the set language have all been picked up from that organizational model I defined. So, you know, the privileges I assign to individual resources, positions, group names, etc. So I can do some fairly complex work distribution there based upon RQL. And they're kind of shades of gray and mixes and match between the two mechanisms. Along the way, also talked about workflow patterns. So if we take a look at our friend make payment here, very simply I'm saying my make payment activity is in a separation of duties with my review activity. So the same participant definition is involved with the two tasks, but I've just applied a simple separation of duty pattern across the two, and it will take that one user out of the set. You see a few other things here related to resource patterns as well. These aren't the full set. These are the ones that just make sense to apply here. So you can see retain familiar, offering versus offer to all versus offer to one, allocation patterns, etc., piling. So things that make sense. So here the resource patterns are applied on the process model as well as on the org model. And finally, at the end here, another little example here, but the interesting, this activity is being delivered through a participant called Langdef. langpref. Langpref is actually not a regular participant, but is in fact a performer field. And what that means is that actually, if I look at the script here, I can dynamically build up that RQL string. So I can dynamically build the expression. I can load it out of a database. I can generate it from another application and pick it up completely dynamically as I see fit. So it's all completely dynamic as well. It's kind of a quick tour through what we call work management. But actually, when you kind of then build on top of that for branch network style organizations, the things get even more significant. So if you take the 3 largest branch networks in the United States, this is what you're talking about in terms of branch numbers. So they're big. So the simple fact is you can't sit there and draw all of those organizational units within your organizational model. You've got to find a different mechanism to deal with that. You need to make things more dynamic. The other challenge you have is that these big corporate organizations, the LDAP structure can change any time beneath you, and you need to be able to cope with that change as well. If you bind your processes directly to the LDAP concepts, it's a very brittle model. Either your LDAP's going to change and break everything, or nothing can move forward at the correct pace. You need the model there to provide the level of indirection away from the corporate directory structure. And at the end of the day, I want to just be able to define a single activity that is scope to my branch and just say deliver it to the manager of branch X. Kind of bringing that into the picture. A little bit of a static model at the top, but I want all of this underneath to be dynamic. I want the branches to appear and disappear. I want the resources to be mapped in and out of those organizational positions within the branch. And then I want to be able to define dynamically how to deliver work into that position within the branch. So if we go now and look at this other example here, this organizational model now is slightly different. You'll see here, I've got the concept of a branch office. This is actually a dynamic organizational unit. You can see it's appeared over here in the palette. And that is then bound and referenced to just a regular org model. Okay, you can see there it's just picking up and referencing a regular org model. This regular org model actually has been defined, though, saying this is a dynamic organization, and I have to name something, an attribute I'm saying is what's going to identify this dynamic org model. How am I going to identify them? In the case of my LDAP directory, I've got an attribute called OU, which contains a town value like Paris, London, etc. But it could just as easily be a branch ID as well. When I've got that guy deployed into the runtime, you can see here now different org model, but all deployed, and I'm seeing multiple sandboxes here. But there's the top level static directory that we define. Okay, but we're here under branch network. Now the system has automatically created multiple instances of that branch model based upon finding instances of that town attribute. So London, Paris, Swindon, Newbury. And those who know me know that's the town in England I live in. Swindon, of course, is the home of the mighty AMX BPM software development team. And you can see down here, actually I'm going to go and use London. You can see down here I've got sales and I've got an agent position here that I've mapped multiple resources to. So if I then want to go and use that and dynamically deliver work into it, I can capture some customer data here, the town variable, and then deliver work to a resource. That resource is still just a regular participant called branch sales agent. However, there's a piece of scoping information that goes on here where I can just map a process variable into that town element I created when I defined my dynamic org model. And hey presto, then I can have a single model. I don't need to care about what lives where. Things can change under the hood, but I can scope the process to a particular branch, etc. So that's an example of something having to deal with large branch network structures, but not wanting to bind a lot of the LDAP information to your process model, allow your processes to be completely independent of the corporate directory structure. I have one more slide and then I am done. I'm ready for my beer. So, kind of, what's the summary of my manifesto? So to me, you know, for really, for mass adoption of BPM in these sorts of enterprises I'm talking about, when I talk about enterprise BPM, you know, the model-driven work management and resource pattern stuff is critical. Otherwise, you end up writing so much custom stuff, the solution becomes too heavyweight, too brittle, and doesn't move quickly enough. Actually, it hasn't been an area of focus from vendors. It's not particularly sexy, it's hard, and actually it's very rarely recognized as being important by customers at tool selection time. It very, very rarely comes into play with a proof of concept at sales time. And very little focus on the standards group, and as somebody who thinks that the resource pattern work is a very good piece of work, it kind of seems to have petered out, and it's very, very, very good piece of work. I'm a great believer that the world's going to move towards declarative processes a lot more, and the fact is that as processes become more declarative, the activities have to get more intelligent. You cannot be wiring this functionality into your custom process model when you're using declarative processes. So your activity is going to have to become more important, and this work's going to have to become more important. And that's me done.